Welcome back to part 2 of how to finish your hat. For my hat, I've decided that I'm going to use this black and white fabric that's a reproduction, a print of African mud cloth to pair with this Ankara African fabric that I chose for my hat. And I also want to make a very simple flower using this technique where you create a tube. So this is just a rectangle piece of fabric that I folded in half, and then I use a very long gather stitch. You can see that the stitches are rather long. I gathered it, and then what you do is pull your thread, tuck in the end here. So I'm going to take my end and tuck it here, and then start to swirl it or twirl it like a flower to create a rosette, or maybe the word is rosé, but I'll do a little bit, and then I like to pinch it on the back here, and then take my needle and thread and go ahead and stitch it through, kind of like a whip stitch. This actually doesn't have to be all that pretty because we're not going to see it, and then once it's done, I'm going to sew it to my hat. But what's really important is to remember that I have not sewn my lining. You can sew your lining together, but I don't want to attach it. So right now my hat is still open. This way all of the stitches that I do will be on the underside of the hat, and then when I put my lining on the inside, you won't see any of the stitches. A lot of times in theater we end up having to sew things all the way through to the lining. It's totally fine. I mean, someone's going to wear it on their head, no one's going to see it, but in more traditional millinery, it's best to do all of your decorations first and then put your lining on your hat. I went ahead and tacked my band down, that way it won't keep moving, and then just so it doesn't keep shifting on me, I just pinned it in place, and then I can take these pins out. But sometimes I will do like a little tack stitch here and maybe on the opposite side, on this side, because sometimes when we put hats on, because we're moving them and flexing, I've noticed that bands will start to slide up a little bit. Some people like to glue, but I don't believe in gluing anything on hats. I just feel like glue is just not a sustainable way. And now I'm going to add my rosette here to the side of my hat. And I'll just again use a little tack stitch to stitch it on, and then it'll look kind of like this. The lining for our hat is exactly how we put the crown and band. So essentially we are sewing this piece and this piece together without the interfacing. First things first, we have to connect our band together. And remember, our stitch is 5/8 inch. Now, just like before, we need to find the middle of our crown. So I always like to fold in half, create a finger press, which works really well when you have cotton fabric. You can manipulate the fabric very easily. If you have something else, then go ahead and just use a pen and place it here to mark it. So I know that this is one end of the center of my hat band. So let's go ahead and fold it. Here's the other end, finger crease again. And just like before, with right sides together, I'm going to start lining this up. Now, I've always found that this was much easier to do because I didn't have the interfacing working against me. The interfacing, that buckram really doesn't want to curve. So we're always fighting something that doesn't want to curve on a project that's all curves, all circles. So again, I'm pinning center to center, and then I will pin, I like to say north, south, east, west. That's just how I think of it. Pin, and then pin. So as you can see, we're already starting to form I hope you can see this. There's still a little extra excess on this side. So just like before, I'm going to snip, not past my seam, like here. I'm going to give it a little snip, and give this one a little snip. This way I can slash and spread, and both sides will be able to lay even. Circles are tricky, so I'm going to go ahead and do that all the way around and then start sewing. It's important that you give a little tension. This will help flatten everything. So I take this hand and pull just slightly. Not enough to distort it, but enough to make everything lay flat. And then, so you can see here on the camera, as it slowly go around. So our head is sewn, or I should say our lining is sewn all the way around, and now I can flip it inside out. But really, it goes like this. I just like to look at it inside out, just to make sure it looks good. Now, take our hat, and place inside. Find the center again. Find the center and match it up with our hat center. That way you know that the oval, because this hat is very ovular, will match. Kind of zhuzh it in here. And what I like to do is then I'm going to cut this down because I think it's a little bit too long and just is going to create bulk. So I'm going to cut it down to about 1/4 of an inch. So you can take this out if you don't want to accidentally cut your lining. So I'm going to take my scissors, right? So we see the line here. I sewed it in white so it'd be easier for the camera. Normally I would probably sew it in something a little bit more neutral. I'm going to take my scissors and cut it down to maybe 1/4 of an inch. You can see. So now we have a much smaller seam allowance here from our big seam allowance here. Now, what I like to do, I just find this to be the simplest method of finishing this edge off, is to, so this is our lining, right? This is the right side of the lining. This is the wrong side of the lining. I've lined it up with the center seam of the back of our hat. I'm going to fold this down at roughly 5/8 of an inch, which would be our seam allowance, as if we were to sew it. Line it here, and then I'm going to put a pin in it while I adjust everything else. So I have a pin in here. Then I'm going to go to the other side, but I still have my crease here. If you have a fabric that doesn't have a crease, feel free to make a little mark on the back side. That way you can find it. And push this in here. Fold this 5/8 under. Lay it on top of the seam line because we want to hide that seam line. Pin it. And then from there, continue until you've done that all the way around. Now, once this is done, make sure your excess is distributed evenly. Again, I'm going to use a color that I would never use, but it's just for the camera purposes. I'm going to take my thread, but normally I would probably use like a yellow, probably this orange color here so it blends in. I'm going to do a, you could either do a whip stitch like we did for some of our other projects, or you could do a slip stitch, which a slip stitch is basically a rocking stitch that goes in between what would be the lining and the hat. For today's demonstration, I'm going to do a whip stitch because I think it'll be easier to see on the camera. So I'm going to start with our lining, going up. I want to try to hide that knot, and I'm going to pick up a little bit of fabric on this side, go through, pick up a little bit of fabric through the lining, and I'm going to remove my straight pin here because it's going to get in the way. And then do another stitch. Now continue this all the way around, but what's going to happen is it's going to close off this raw edge that we have here, this raw edge and this stitch line there, and then you'll have this really beautiful hand done edge to your hat. And that's the last step. So we've put on a band, we have a little decoration, which you can do whatever decoration you want. I've ironed it. I always end up ironing them a couple more times once I'm done, because as you're manipulating it, you kind of crinkle it. But that is the end of all the steps to making a hat. And next step, I guess, is just to wear it and take pictures with it and have fun with whatever hat you've created. So thank you for watching, and I might have one more little clip of the finished project at the end of this video.